Hello. Things are a little different now because I have my granddaughters staying with me, well, one of my granddaughters staying with me over the Easter holidays, and I've had to retreat for the sake of silence because she races about, makes quite a lot of noise. So I am now under the roof in the attic. I moved out of my office. I'm trying to do this on a laptop, and I just hope it's going to work. Anyway, the things I do for you, I hope you appreciate this. Now, I have a lot of trolls on this channel since I started talking about Ukraine. And a lot of people who tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, so obviously they think they know better than me and they've unsubscribed, and that's not going to stop me. And the names that the trolls call me is not going to stop me. As I've said, I've been called worse and had it met with physical violence as well. So, you know, this is nothing. Now, the idea for this particular video was taken from a comment of one of these trolls. I was talking about who is basically who might be to blame in the Ukraine-Russian thing, and one of the commenters said, "I'll bet you think that Assad used nerve gas on his citizens as well, don't you?" Well, yes, I do. And that's because I've read some books on the subject. And one of the books mostly the book I'm going to be using for this, which will be about the Skripal poisoning, is a book called Toxic by Dan Kaszeta. And it's an excellent book, very informative, but I mean, he's not the only source I've had. So yes, I do know what I'm talking about. And I'm going to give you a rundown about the Skripal poisoning, simply because for those of you who aren't in the UK, you might not have heard of it. And then I'm going to show you what the Russian various organs of information in Russia have done with the story, because when you know about that, it might be useful for when you're trying to assess other things. I don't expect this to convince anybody who is convinced that the West is all wrong and Russia's all right. If you want to believe that, you know, that's your prerogative. It's not being very intelligent, because what you're saying is that Russia is more truthful than the West. I'm not saying the West is truthful. I'm not saying Ukraine is truthful. I am saying in every war, various sides tell lies and do awful things. I suppose some of you will know about the bombing of Coventry. Very early in the war, the Second World War, the British cracked the uncrackable German Enigma code. But they didn't want the Germans to know that. And when they knew that the bombers were going to come over and flatten Coventry, they had a dilemma. Should they prepare everybody and save lives? Or should they let the Germans bomb Coventry to smithereens and pretend it was a big surprise? Because then the Germans would assume that the British didn't have any information ahead. And they made the awful decision, and I'm using awful in the technical sense, to ignore the warning, you know, not to pretend they hadn't got it. And Coventry was flattened with great loss of life, and I might say loss of a beautiful medieval cathedral. Terrible thing. And whether they did the right thing or not, we'll never know. We assume they did because there were many other things they knew about the Germans, because the Germans weren't aware that their code had been cracked. Okay, so there are terrible things that happen in all wars, and terrible lies told. I mean, the British were lying with the Coventry bombing by pretending they didn't know about how to tap in on German conversations, did they? So I'm not saying the Ukrainians are absolutely correct in everything they do. And I'm not saying the Russians are absolutely wrong in everything they do. But the Russians invaded Ukraine. And as far as I'm concerned, that means they are automatically in the wrong, whatever they did. And they haven't been behaving well, although we will see comments under this video who say they do. And that they're acting like saints the whole way along. Well, you know, there's nothing I can do about people with that sort of a mindset. Now, I'm going to talk about the Skripal poisoning. There was a Russian defector who had been a GRU officer called Sergei Skripal, and he was living in Salisbury. Now, two Russian men who styled themselves sports nutrition salesmen turned up in London. It later turned out they were two GRU agents. One of them, such a highly decorated agent that his photograph was on the wall of the academy where he'd learned his skill, his craft. And they went to Salisbury, where Sergei Skripal lived. Later on, this was after the poisoning and the big diplomatic fuss that resulted from that, they were back in Russia, but they said they'd been in Salisbury to look at the medieval cathedral there. But when they arrived by train in Salisbury, they, let's say the church spire was there, and Sergei Skripal's house was there, and they headed there, which is a little strange. After that visit, what happened? They went to Salisbury one day and then they came back. Looks like a reconnaissance visit. And then they went the next day and they came back and went straight to Moscow, during which time Skripal and his daughter Yulia became very ill, and, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So Skripal and Yulia became ill. They were out on a, just a day out. They went to a restaurant and everything, and then they started to feel very bad indeed, and they sat on a park bench where Yulia collapsed on the ground and her father was just rolling around. People assumed they were drunk, but they did call the ambulance, and they had to be taken to hospital, and the Skripals had to be taken to hospital, and they were intubated, and blood tests revealed there was almost no ACE in their bodies. ACE is an important enzyme, and it's the enzyme which almost any nerve agent attacks. And when the samples were sent to Porton Down, which was a big biolab, and much has been made of this, it's on the outskirts of Salisbury. It was about 10 miles from where the Skripals lived. Where the tests they did identified the nerve agent as Novichok A234. Now, Novichok, that's wonderful, isn't it? It sounds delicious, like a box of Easter goodies or something, but it's almost exclusively Russian recipe. So the two men had called themselves Alexandra Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov, and this is what happened. When the British government realised there was a case of Novichok poisoning, they immediately accused the Russians without any proof of it, without any tracking. And of course, the Russians refuted it straight away. And first of all, they said these two people didn't exist. This is a technique that you will see cropping up as I go through the narrative. Alexandra Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov did not exist. And then, after a few days, or after a little while, they were produced on the Russian TV channel RT, where they were interviewed and repeated that they were sports nutrition salesmen. And there was a sort of implication that they were also a gay couple. However, when they had been interviewed, websites in the West, various websites, identified them as Colonel Anatoly Chebiga and Dr. Alexander Mishkin, both serving GRU officers. And later on, investigators found traces of Novichok in the London hotel where they'd been staying before they went to Salisbury. So that's the basis. I'm missing out lots of stuff, and people say, well, what about this and what about that? You know, I don't have time. A whole chapter of a book was written on this incident. I'm just cutting it down to some bare bones. So what I'm going to be talking about is how the Russian disinformation campaign ground into action. And the first thing was, first of all, they denied these two men existed, and then they said they existed and interviewed them. And that's, you'd think that people might notice a disconnect there, people in Russia, but they don't seem to notice. They seem to remember the last thing that was said and discard everything that happened before. So within days of the poisoning, when, as I said, the British government and the reportages of various sorts were speculating that it was a Russian job. I mean, after all, Skripal was a defector. And obviously, if somebody's going to be killing him, then the top of the list of suspects would be his old colleagues in the GRU, surely. But they didn't have the hard evidence, so they were making wild accusations with no evidence. Meanwhile, the Russian state media and bots were pumping out more mutually contradictory and sometimes crazy stories. So here's the list. Okay, anyone who said that Russians had poisoned the Skripals was a Russophobe. It was racism. Right, the second thing was, the other thing, and these were put out by various agencies. I'm talking about news agencies, the foreign ministry, various ministers in the government. You know, I'm not listing them all, but they came from official type sources, and then they started circulating among conspiracy theorists and open-minded people. I'm not saying it was always that bad. People who didn't want to automatically assume it was a Russian thing. So there was a lot of churning information going on. So look, everyone who says it was the Russians is a Russophobe. Right. Second one, it was an accidental drug overdose, probably fentanyl. Okay. Fentanyl has certain characteristics, and they didn't show any of those. This is a big one, it was an accidental leak from Porton Down. Now, you know, that sounds reasonable enough. Porton Down was less than 10 miles or so away from where the Skripals live. But then I live, well, in fair distance of Marks and Spencer's. That doesn't mean to say I'm going to suddenly develop Marks and Spencer's food on my table without actually going there. If you think, Porton Down is a very high security establishment, and for an accidental leak to have happened, this would have meant that if there was Novichok there, and there could be, it had got from its main container, wherever it was, into some sort of other container, and then had made its way through the high security gateways out into the Salisbury countryside, and then it had managed to make its way all the way across fields and towns and streets, harming neither man nor beast until it got to the Skripal's doorknob, because that's where they had picked it up. It was smeared on their doorknob. It was found later. Anyway, all right. So that was the other theory. It's an accidental leak from Porton Down. The next one was suicide. Skripal, because he had deserted his GRU pals, was trying to commit suicide. He had his daughter there as well. I mean, she was about to get married, I believe. Okay, now, next one. The British government had done it to provoke a boycott of the World Cup. Now, I'm just telling you this because these are all things that were coming from accredited Russian sources. Right, the next one was, after the World Cup business, they were saying it was the Americans who did it. And then a day after that, RT was saying it was the Ukrainians. Oh, those poor Ukrainians. They're always getting the blame, aren't they? Now, a day after that, it was Theresa May, the Prime Minister at the time, as she had a good relationship with the head of the CIA. Right after that, it was the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who said it was a hyped up British response to Brexit. Okay, after that, it was a poisoning attempt by the prospective mother-in-law of Skripal's daughter. So the mother-in-law was trying to poison Yulia Skripal. She obviously didn't like her that much, and I'm telling you, these aren't wild theories that came out of nowhere. They came out of newspapers and broadcasts on radio or television, or pronouncements by ministers or government officials. These are all traceable back to accredited sources within Russia. Okay, next one. Only Sweden, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and the British had Novichok, which is not true. And they'd used it in an attempt to undermine Russia's role as a peacemaker in Syria. All right. At the same time, Russian social accounts were saying there is no such thing as Novichok. It's just been made up. Right. Next one, the Skripals, it was the result of a drone strike. And then an anti-Putin campaigner called Bill Browder was responsible for it. Okay, then Theresa May again. She had invented Novichok. Apparently there's a well-known chemist called Theresa May, not the same person. And they used that as a theory. Okay, after that, a theory came out that it was I'm not making this up. This is all listed in Kaszeta's, and I actually checked some of them. They're all checked out. So it was the British aristocracy who apparently have a habit of poisoning people they think beneath them. Okay, all right, it was the Americans. It's your turn, guys. It was the Americans who came up with Novichok. And then, there was another theory. The British had poisoned Ivan the Terrible, so it was obvious they'd poisoned Sergei Skripal as well. Okay, I hope you're enjoying this. A British plot to justify higher military spending. Right, Foreign Minister Lavrov again, so he made that first thing, and then he stated that it was actually a chemical agent called BZ, and he said that had been detected in samples from Salisbury, which is, an absolute fairy tale. There was no BZ in that, and actually BZ is a hallucinogenic compound. It's not a nerve agent, and it's not toxic either. It's true it was being used by the CIA. I think it was being used by Britain as well. It was used to extract information from spies, but it was definitely not toxic. Okay, right, after that, it was put down to, now there's a list here, Israelis, Zionists or Jews. They're sort of interchangeable in this situation. After that, it was a hoax cooked up by Freemasons. And later on, the whole thing was a hoax, and it actually never happened. The Skripals, who I might say spent, well, Yulia was 20 days in a coma in the Salisbury General Hospital. Right, so these were all various theories that were put out, they were theories, you know, speculations, stories that were put out by the Russians to discredit the theory that it was the Russians who were to blame. And then a reasonable person might ask, why did they do this? Why didn't they just have one story and stick to it? Why all these contradictory stories? For instance, Novichok is an American poison, and then Novichok doesn't exist. Or it was a suicide attempt, and then it was Yulia Skripal's future mother-in-law. Yeah, again, that Porton Down thing. Yeah, it's really easy for a highly toxic compound to sort of spring out of a top security lab and get, as I say, right across town and then smear itself on the Skripal's doorknob. Well, look, if you believe that one, then please PM me, because, you know, I have a bridge I'd like to sell you. Okay, so as I said, you may ask why there are so many theories circulating, and why didn't they just stick to one story? Well, it's a very clever device. First of all, different people, different stories appeal to different people. So it's likely, you know, each little story will get circulation among various groups of people who like that particular stories. And then when there are all sorts of different stories, it makes it difficult to focus on one untruth. And it also, it undermines your ideas of truth and falsehood. You know, there's such an overburden of tall tales. You just throw up your hands and say, you know, you just give up. And you give up, except for the trolls, of course, who I've no doubt will have a lot of fun with this. And I might lose even more people who are subscribers who are offended by my trying to find out what's really going on. But, well, yeah, there's nothing much I can do about that. And I'm not going to be put off by those sorts of people. So the point I'm making here is that you have to be aware that the Russians have turned truth, or rather the murder of truth, into an industry, into a mass production. Now, all governments do a little bit of disinformation, but I don't think that any government, apart from the Soviet one, you know, that I know of, has developed the destruction of truth to such a high degree. And when they're talking about what's happening in Ukraine, you have to take that into account. All right, well, I hope this this little laptop manages the video all right. And I'm Graniopteryx. I am to be found on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. I let you know when I've uploaded a video as @Graniopteryx on Twitter, Gab and Parler. And please press the like button, support my channel, please. What else? Share the video and make sure you're subscribed. All right, that's it, I think. Until next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.